And I know Casey Conway requires no introduction. Casey is the CCIM Institute economist. He's from the University of Alabama. Casey was recently honored by the Institute and made an honorary CCIM along with two others. And I've always considered Casey one of our own. He's really been a big part of what we've been doing here, and particularly since this coronavirus has struck, and some of you have been fortunate to have been on all the presentations that Casey's given. They've been compelling, they've been uplifting. I want to thank Casey. I want to tell you that the honor is well-deserved, Casey. And I also want to thank our sponsors, RealNex and American Home Title of Tampa Bay. And if our sponsors are on board right now, but before we bring our sponsors here, I wanted to reach out to our associates and our members in the Puerto Rico chapter. I could see that some of them are on board. We did invite them for this, and we'll make sure that we keep them in the loop for future events, not just Casey's presentation, but any event that the Florida chapter has. Thank you for being here today. We hope you enjoyed today's presentation, and we look forward to you being on these in the future. Is anybody from RealNex or American Title on board? So we appreciate our sponsors, RealNex and American Title of Tampa Bay. If you do get on the call, we want to give you an opportunity to speak. So just let us know. But having said that, we're going to turn it over to Casey Conway and for another one of his great presentations. Casey, you have the floor.
Great. Thank you, Terry. It's an honor to be back. I'm so glad you've got the Puerto Rico chapter or the Puerto Rico folks on board. I had an opportunity to go visit and meet with many of them, with Barbara Crane in your Florida region and chapter president last August. And we were discussing beforehand, Terry, you mentioned that they just had another earthquake. And, if any of us feel bad or troubled about our lives right now, you need to just reflect on all that our friends in Puerto Rico have endured over the last couple of years, whether it's, Maria, or then the next brush with the next hurricane that almost did a direct hit, but hit the Bahamas, or this is now the second earthquake. They find a way to just pick themselves up and keep moving forward. So I tip my hat to Puerto Rico and the folks there, and anything that they need or whatnot. I know, Terry, you're there and I'm there as well. Anything we can do to ever help them. And I know the Florida chapter was very gracious after Maria. So I tip my hat to Florida. And with regards to the honorary designation, I told Craig Fine, Barbara Crane, Eddie Blanton, Dave Wilson, that they were just really searching for a way to make an Irishman speechless. So they figured out how to make me speechless. I'm very, very humbled and still don't know quite how to find the words to express my gratitude. It's very, very nice honor. So thank you. All right, there's our cover slide. We'll go to the second one, which will have my usual disclaimer. So it's all on me. You guys are insulated. And we'll go to our first slide, then the next one. So in case you hadn't figured it out, it's Cinco de Mayo. Don't confuse it with Independence Day, Mexican Independence Day. That comes in September, and I'm sure we'll have a few beverages with that. I was struck when I was doing a little research that the most important thing that kept coming up was that we consume more beer and have more beer sales on Cinco de Mayo than we do on Super Bowl Sunday. So I don't know what that tells us and whatnot, but and actually the Cinco de Mayo is celebrated and embraced more here in the United States than it is in Mexico, really showing the strength of our Mexican American community. So I tip my hat to our Mexican American community, and I guess it's okay to have a taco today or some Mexican food or whatnot. Just take home or do it at home, and do it on a Zoom. Maybe we'll have Zoom Cinco de Mayo. If the Supreme Court yesterday can do arguments and opening live virtual on Zoom, I guess we can have Zoom Cinco de Mayo today. So happy Cinco de Mayo Day. Go on to the next slide. All right. So the topic today in this week's session, this Tuesday's lunch session, is really our reopening of our economies and our states. And I think it's really important that we put these reopenings in perspectives and that we clearly understand that we're taking a calculated risk here. None of the states and we as a country have not met any of the hurdles that were laid out for us to appropriately reopen. And so it's not medically based, it's not number of cases based why we're reopening. It really is more economically driven. The economic damage is so great and so difficult that really we're taking the calculated risk to maybe go forward on from an economic standpoint than we are a medical standpoint. I'm not passing judgment on that. I'm just saying we need to understand that. We need to understand the calculated risk that we're taking state by state and as a country, because my fear is all that we've been through and the trillions of dollars of intervention could be quickly unwound if we're not careful here. Um, I go between Alabama and Georgia. I was very critical of our Georgia governor that his initial reopening opened almost everything, including tattoo parlors and bowling alleys. And I felt that was very irresponsible and the wrong way to go about this so that we don't have a relapse. So this is a map. Sometimes the New York Times, they do well with exhibits and graphics, and maybe sometimes not so much with their commentary. But this was a very simple graph. The dark green show who's at a partial reopening. And then on the other end, you can see who are still shut down. And these are our areas that were most afflicted. The Northeast and the West Coast, the New York region. And so what we have to ask as we open up and start moving around, the impact. We have college students that went home to those regions. At the University of Alabama, this was the first year that we had over half of our students that were from outside Alabama. So a lot of them went home. A lot of them were from New York region, Connecticut, California. So as they come back, we need to think about this. And what we're finding is there's a large part of our population that is asymptomatic. And us men, we always like to have something to blame women for. So we're going to blame women for the problem here. Women, because you have a extra X chromosome, for whatever reason they haven't figured out yet, you're more likely to be asymptomatic and not have as a difficult time with the virus if you don't have underlying conditions and you're not of the age cohort than men. So just one more thing us men want to blame women for. We can throw this in the bucket. But if we have this asymptomatic population that migrate out, we do not yet have enough testing in place to know what we don't know. And so we don't have the testing in place. We're not broadly testing. I recently wrote a piece for the university for our real estate center. And I noted that in Alabama, as they reopen, they haven't even tested 100,000 people yet. So when you think of that of the overall population, every state is in that same boat or perspective. So I want to start with that as we look at this map and how much is reopening, that it's more economically driven, and we'll spend a little more time on that. So we can advance to the next slide. So this is what really drives it home, and I try to bring it home to Florida. So if you recall, when we started these webinars around the 1st of April, we didn't even have 900,000 cases of the virus globally, not even 1 million globally. Today, the United States, a month later, has more in just the United States than we did globally 4 weeks ago. So if you're in the mindset that it's all going away and the cases are going down, you're mistaken. As you see in the lower right corner there with Florida, the trajectory has come down. The isolation did work, but we still are having cases that are occurring and rising, but just not at the same trajectory. Look at the United States. We've got almost 1.2 million cases. I pulled this morning. That is a multiple, 4 to 5 times the next highest nation, Spain. And if you look all the way down there, there's less than 100,000 in China. Now, I will tell you, if you believe there's only 100,000 cases in China, I will tell you that Terry and I will go to work and we will find you a lot of great oceanfront real estate in Nevada to help market to you. Would you agree to that, Terry? We'll find that. China is not been completely forthcoming with us during this thing for whatever reason. I'm not going to get into, politically or the motivations, but if you believe a country with over 1 billion people where this originated has less than 100,000 cases, it's just not credible. So I don't put that in the credibility area. Italy alone, half of those cases are probably from the 100,000 workers that China sent home after closing back to Italy to run the Italian brand companies after they canceled their Chinese New Year and they were already infected. That's how it got to Europe, is China had been investing in all those Italian brand companies. They didn't want to move the manufacturing back to China and lose the made in Italy panache and value. So they moved 100,000 workforce into Northern Italy. And that's how we got it there, and it spread from there. We didn't know that, and that's why we didn't shut down Europe earlier, along with what we did in China at the end of January. And had we and the rest of the world known that, it might not have spread. But I put this up there. The Johns Hopkins University website is by far the best out there. Daily updates, good graphics. You can drill down into cases and the rate of infection and everything else, any way you want to slice and visualize the data. So that's the big concern. The other one, I'm going to enlarge my screen here a minute, Terry, is in terms of and I apologize, I stressed Terry and Mary today. I got them their slides at 10 o'clock. So I have some typos in here. So my first key notation down there, the COVID-19 cases, they are eerie. So maybe that was subliminal instead of pre-COVID or 900,000. Again, the US has 1/3 of all global cases, and the cases are not going away. And you can see your Florida graphics. So if you go into either the New York Times piece or Johns Hopkins, you can get your visualization for Florida as you lift off. So let's go on to the next slide, Terry. So here's the one I've shared with you a little bit in the past. This shows this fiscal health situation. So if we have cases still occurring and the numbers are still rising from less than 1 million to over 3.5 million in 4 weeks, why are we reopening? And this is going to help bring it home. It's more of a calculated risk on the economic damage and the need to open up because there just aren't enough funds to continue in perpetuity with this sheltering in place. So you've seen this one I've shared with you before, the total balances that states have. Florida was in pretty good shape with 40 days in there. I'll move something here real quick. With 40 days in there. And so you were among the 10 best. But in May 2020, most states only have about 25%. So this data was originally compiled by the Pew Charitable Trust at the end of March through March for the 1st of April. A month later, all those balances you see on this map, there's only about 25% left. So in reality, Florida, you have about 10 days from what you've had to deal with. And as you know, living in Florida, you have a little bit of a challenge right now in getting unemployment insurance claims paid and processed. So you're looking at something like 10 days, not your 40 days. So that's a little bit of an update. If you look on the left there, in terms of COVID cases, Florida, if you looked at states and provinces around the world. So the United States has all but one of the provinces or states with the most cases. The only other one, Hubei, China. So isn't it funny that Hubei, China has almost as many cases as all of what China is reporting? But anyway, New York and New Jersey have the worst. Florida follows right after Michigan. So you'd be number 8 in the US and 9 globally with 37,000 cases. So what's really driving this thing is not the cases are going down, not the medical issues, it's an economic. So let's go to the next slide and see how that's really playing out. So this is where the rubber meets the road, and states and their governors are having to deal with how much unemployment do we have left and what are our insurance reserves. So you can begin to see Georgia's down to 11 days. That's why they opened up. The states, which you have to appreciate, is that after the 2009 financial crisis, the states depleted their unemployment insurance trust funds, and they actually had to borrow from the Federal Reserve and the federal government to replenish those, and those were loans. And most states spent over 5 years repaying those. So really until about 2015, most of the states were repaying their borrowings for unemployment insurance from 2009, 10, and 11. And so that's why our states really didn't have a built up reserve going in this time, was they had just gotten back to paying off their debt and were rebuilding those reserves. So now let's look at Florida. And I have to call, as you guys know me, that when I see something that I know just isn't true, I've known the polite way after living 40 years in the South is to call it barbecue sauce. So you see Florida there saying it's got 90 weeks of unemployment benefits to pay out. Terry, is it barbecue sauce?
Yeah, absolutely.
You
No
guys know,
question.
one, you're not paying it out. You have a system that isn't able to process but a fraction of, so you really don't know what's in there. And from other people doing the data, they're saying that probably you've got, you know, like everybody else, you're down to something less than a month. So don't believe all of these numbers. Look at how bad, say, California is. California is down to, again, and this was the 1st of April, was 4 weeks. California, I can tell you today, it's empty. They're going to have to borrow to keep their unemployment insurance going. And again, these numbers are as of April 4th, so fast forward a full month, you know, these numbers are, you know, half to a quarter of what you saw here. So our states are going to have to borrow to fund this, and we're going to have one more intervention. So we're going to be skiing to see the real political debate that's going to come about for the November elections. And that debate is, we have states that are not on equal footing from a fiscal standpoint, and some are going to need more help than less help. So for example, in Illinois, they're in pretty rough shape. But a lot of those retirees that are collecting their retirement benefits from working in the auto business or whatnot in Illinois are living in Florida. So they're spending their checks and they're spending their money in Florida, but they're drawing out of Illinois, and Illinois has lost that demographic and population that would support their country. So it is somewhat disingenuous to say in Illinois and New York or whatever have been totally fiscally reckless because their unfunded liabilities have skyrocketed. A lot of this has been the evolution of industry. It's been population migration. We are the United States of America. Whether we like it or not, we're all in this problem together. Some of us are in fiscally better shape than others. But I think the way things are shaping up for the November elections is those states that were maybe are perceived as fiscally more solid and strong today. Those are predominantly in the South, from Texas across to Southeast and Florida, in parts of the Midwest, that they really feel it's going to be offensive to see more federal funding that's not equally shared going to states that are on less fiscal ground. Regardless of the political side of the debate you're on, that's the reality. That's going to divide us more going into November. And that's what's going to hold up additional fiscal funding that we need, whether it's unemployment, whether it's in our industry taking care of the mortgage servicers, that if they go bankrupt and can't function, CRE finance breaks. There's just a lot of tentacles to this. Municipal bonds for airports and key infrastructure at ports. You guys have a lot of ports. So the Fed's in now buying those bonds and helping. So we all are going to have to give and take here a little bit, but this is going to be the big dividing issue. And don't be lulled into a sense of security thinking Florida has 90 weeks of unemployment benefits in its trust. It does not. Is that a safe bet? Am I really going out on a limb there, Terry?
No, I think you're safe, and it's hard to find people that are receiving the benefits. So you're absolutely correct.
Yeah. And keep in mind, you have a lot of, folks that are, maybe didn't have full retirement benefits that are living in Florida that were working at jobs, or youth and college kids working at Disney. Disney's 70,000 workers in the Orlando metropolitan area. And those were maybe 1099 employees. They maybe were subcontractors. They maybe were a sole proprietor that was contracting with Disney. And so before, none of those people would have been entitled to unemployment benefits. And under the CARES Act, we brought in all of the 1099 workers and the sole proprietors. We've never done that. And that's part of what is overwhelming the unemployment benefits. is we've never seen these type of numbers, and the BLS and the states don't know how to process it, because one of the first questions on their form, if you're unemployed and maybe you were a 1099 worker or sole proprietor, is who was your last employer or was your current employer? You don't have one. And even though the CARES Act says that's not an eligible question anymore, it's still on the form and it still drives whether the form gets processed. So if the software system and the company that sold Florida its software to process these has that as one of the first questions and it's kicking everybody out, that's part of the problem. Real difficult issue. So let's go to the next slide. So this is a piece that I wrote that was published Friday or over the weekend for the university on pandemic insurance. And you're like, wait a minute, Casey, we thought we were talking about reopening business. What in the world does pandemic insurance have to deal with anything? It's a really complex, confusing issue, and as I'll get to in a minute, the bottom line is nobody has it. So one of the reasons that the Trump administration and the world are trying to investigate the outbreak of this virus in China and whether the lab that it was and what the motivations were is if it's deemed it was along the lines of terrorism, all of us get some protection and coverage under the TRIA Act from 2001. So if you wonder why there's this discussion and debate at every one or every other one of the Trump press conferences, this is the reason, is they're trying to find a way to get the pandemic classified under TRIA so there can be a payout, because if it isn't terroristic in its roots and origins, you're not covered under TRIA. So let's go beyond TRIA. Let's say this doesn't happen, we don't get it done. Most of our businesses and many of the tenants in our real estate will have business interruption insurance. Those that are more solvent, more sophisticated, more financially strong. Its initials are BI, business interruption insurance. Most of those policies had a rider that dealt with pandemic insurance. So you won't find it under pandemic insurance, you'll find it under business interruption. But here's what's happened. In 2002 and 2003, with the SARS outbreak, the insurance industry realized it didn't have the reserves and didn't underwrite the premiums to be able to handle a pandemic. So most of our businesses that think they have business interruption insurance to cover a pandemic, what they'll find is their riders were updated on renewals and virus and bacteria were eliminated from coverage. So I would say 99.9% of all of our businesses that have business interruption insurance do not have true pandemic insurance or a rider to protect them. But there is something that you can do. Let's say you have that lucky 1/10 or 1% that do have the rider that covers them. What you need to be aware of as a real estate owner or your clients that own real estate and have tenants is that unless the real estate owner was named a named insured in the policy, just like a property and casualty, or you have on your mortgage where you name the insured of, ABC Bank, then there is no requirement that the proceeds, if they do have a successful claim, remit to the property owner for back rent or anything else. So I would say, if you think you have business interruption insurance that protects you and you have the proper riders, really you can aid your clients by looking at those leases. I would bet that, again, 99.9% do not have the property owner as a named insured for benefit. So unlike PPP, that doesn't mean that if they do have a claim that's successful that they're going to have to pay rent. PPP says you got to pay payroll and utilities and rent, and those qualify. That's not the case here. So all's not lost. I talked with my friends at TREP that underwrite and track all this stuff in the securitized permanent debt world. And they found a law firm, and this pandemic piece, you can find my write-up on it, called Massey Gale, that has actually come up with a neat, efficient tactic that can keep the cost of potential litigation, because 100% of all business interruption insurance claims are being disavowed over the pandemic. And it's called an MDL strategy. It's a multi-district litigation. And what this does is it allows claimants, kind of like in a class action suit, to come together and file just one claim or action, and everybody be able to piggyback off of that across states, across jurisdictions, and then one judge consider it in the totality and late other claimants can easily be added without huge cost. So if you think you have a claim, look at this piece, look at I provided the links and the law firms and the TREP folks that have highlighted this MDL strategy that may be a tool to help you or something your clients haven't heard about. So I'm going to tell you the last piece that is so most critical to us reopening our businesses. And it's kind of where I started, is if you're a business and you're ready to reopen. I'll use my wife's hair salon as an example. So she finally felt comfortable enough with the Georgia opening to go get her hair, I don't know if I'm allowed to say colored, UV lighted and trimmed or whatever. And so when she went there, before she could go in, she had to complete an affidavit. She hadn't traveled, she'd been quarantined at home, all this kind of stuff. And the issue is if I or your spouse or anybody go to, let's say, the hair salon or the barber, and let's say that's the only place we've gone or we go in the next 2 weeks, but over the next 2 weeks, we get the virus. We have the ability to make a claim that that hair salon or that business infected me, because that's the only place I went. When I do the tracing, like CDC requires, we're going to trace back to the origins of where I've been. And so businesses are very, very concerned about liability of outbreak as they reopen. So businesses are asking for what they call liability, pandemic liability shield. This is in front of the Trump administration. Larry Kudlow is the bulldog trying to move this through Congress as they come back. Well, let's see, the Senate's come back. We don't know where the hell the Congress is. They're all over the place. Everybody else has to go do their work, but we can't get the House of Representatives to come back and do the people's work. I guess I expressed some ire there, Terry. Sorry about that. But anyway, they're trying to get this liability shield. Liability shield for the pandemic and the virus is critically important for our businesses really fully opening up, because without it, they're not going to be comfortable. They're going to be worried about this liability, and they may not fully open up or offer all the services that we need them to. So communicate, if you have the ability, to your local representatives, your House of Representatives, your Senate, your governor, through our industry up through NAR. Greg Fine is all over this type stuff, and Eddie Blanton. They're coordinated with the National Association of Realtors and Bob Goldberg and Lawrence Yoon to get this issue elevated, because it's very material to our commercial real estate industry. So if we don't provide squeak in the wheel, it doesn't get addressed. Look at the squeak that we brought as an industry in 2 weeks to get 1031 exchanges addressed and pushed out. So with that, I think we'll go to the next slide. We're getting near the end, and we'll open up for some questions because it's a little bit complicated. Everything that I've been sharing with you, keep coming back to this graphic. What do each of these issues? What is reopening? What is liability insurance, liability shield insurance? What do all of these do to affect the value, the demand, and the pricing of our commercial real estate? Is it something that's going to affect the cap rate, or is it going to affect more the NOI? So again, as I said, this is not going to be a cap rate disruptive event yet. I don't think until the Fed decides they want to raise rates, which could be about 100 years after I'm dead. I am being a little facetious. These are going to be more NOI events. So things like the reopening and the insurance, we're going to face a repricing of commercial real estate. If I'm a restaurant, if I'm a retailer, and I can only have a smaller volume of people in my store or my restaurant, and I can only generate a fraction of the revenue I generated before, I can't pay the same rent. And we're going to have to sit down and renegotiate that. That lower NOI, even if we use the same cap rate, is going to result in a lower value. So what is reopening? What is liability insurance? What is liability shield? What do all these things do to positively or negatively impact in this metrics? And it's all going to be on the NOI side. I think that we will end up with, just like after 9/11, we developed TRIA insurance to deal with terrorism. We're going to probably end up with some sort of subsidized pandemic insurance. It's going to be another expense item or an increase to our insurance and property casualty items going forward, which means less NOI, which means lower value. So keep coming back to this. Do what if thinking daily, weekly, with your clients, with your own portfolio around this issue. So I think we got the last slide coming up, Terry, here, and then we can take some questions. Looks like we got a few. So again, I come back to my quote, we'll open up for, Q&I. Winston Churchill had it right. We can't foresee these unfolding events. We can look for clues in earnings and understanding the issues so we understand what the solutions need to be. So liability shield insurance is what I'm sharing with you today that our industry needs to get behind and help see gets passed, because that will accelerate and help the reopening of our businesses. And the last point I'll make is just remember the big takeaway. We're reopening not because it's safe, not because cases are going down, not because we have adequate testing, not because we understand the asymptomatic people or that people that have had the virus can or can't be reinfected. We are reopening because the calculated risk of the continued economic damage is perceived as greater, and we don't have an unlimited pot of money like in our unemployment insurance trust. So we're taking that calculated risk, and that's the big picture that's happening here, and it's not all medical based. Why don't I stop there, Terry, and see who agrees, who thinks I'm crazy, and who thinks I need to go drinking for Cinco de Mayo?
Well, certainly need to do that. So we won't discount that, Casey, but thanks once again for an excellent presentation. I might say that that even though it's Cinco de Mayo, that Corona beer and Dos Equis will not cure the virus, but stay thirsty, my friends. I like your take, Casey, on if, I guess on the conservative view. So I think if all of us had been infected and actually been positive and had the coronavirus, we would all have the conservative view. And that's probably a view that we may embrace after this great experiment that we're embarked upon about reopening the economy. Yes, we have to do it, but we have to do it in a manner that's measured, in a manner that minimizes the damage as far as the virus to individuals acquiring the virus and having to go through either self-cure or hospitalization to be cured, because that is just a tough procedure for the many that have encountered the virus. So take a little more of a conservative view for your sake, for your family's sake. I've got a great question from Kent, Casey, to start the Q&A. And Kent is an appraiser, and he wants to know, what market corrections would you make in the current market?
So that's the tough question. And right before the CCIM mid-year meetings, I was on a 2-hour webinar that the Appraisal Institute did a great job hosting with about 13 of us from property type and all kinds of issues. So the appraiser is tagged with having to make what are known as market correction adjustments. You got to support them. And I tell appraisers a couple of things right now. The appraisals and valuations you're doing today are likely your litigation next year or the year after. And if you don't have good support or you don't know, I encourage them to either decline the assignment or really dig deeper. It's going to take more time and more energy and more creativity to come up with those market corrections. So here's my best piece of advice I've shared with you the past 2 weeks. The earnings. These are SEC file statements under penalty of perjury. They are as bulletproof as you can find. So on a good side, look at a Prologis. Prologis tells you they're collecting all their rent first week of April. They're denying forbearance. They're only doing it for small tenants. Their rents aren't being affected. They have strong demand for new leasing. They don't see vacancy going above 6%. I can go on and on. So I could cite a Prologis as a big public company that's filed these SEC statements. It's the biggest warehouse operator in North America. And I have a pretty defensible, I've never had a challenge in court where a judge said relying on SEC earnings statements is not a defensible or reasonable means for a market adjustment. Never lost it, almost never even been challenged. So for the appraisers, I would say there's a lot of good nuggets in those earnings releases. Look at a Southwest airline. Let's say you're doing tourism and you're doing a hotel. Look at what Disney, look at what Southwest Airlines, look at what Carnival Cruise, look at these related companies are telling the market and their investors about that industry segment and what to expect. And then if you don't know how big of adjustment to make, if it's an airline, an airport facility, a hangar, or a hotel, You can throw in the Warren Buffett quotes from over the weekend where he basically destroyed the airline industry, the tourism industry, the travel industry, all in one fell swoop. I was talking with Terry before the call, and I said, I think maybe someone needs to let Warren Buffett watch the Disney movie Bambi from 50 something years ago and focus on the character thumper. If you don't have something nice to say, just don't say nothing at all. It's fine for Warren to admit they have losses in an industry segment or whatnot, but to go to the level that he did and drive all of these stocks down 7 to 10%, cause Hertz Rental yesterday's earnings to say, we give up after the Berkshire Hathaway. We've already retained a specialist to help us go through bankruptcy. These earnings tell you certain things. Now, I'll tell you, Southwest Airlines was much more encouraging. So Southwest Airlines said, look, we own half our planes. We have a big cash reserve of $7 billion. We're not going to go through the government bailout program. We'll probably maybe go through bankruptcy to discharge our obligations on airline purchases, renegotiate labor contracts with unions, renegotiate gate agreements, and realign our route structure. So that's concerning if you're a secondary market. If you're a primary market like Miami with international ties, or Tampa or Orlando, I think what Southwest Airlines has said, their bottom line, their CEO said, was if there's a reason to go there, we're going to fly there. So whether it's for business, whether it's for convention, whether it's tourism and destination, that's how Southwest is going to realign. So you may have a bigger immediate impact and less of a longer. If I'm in say a St. Louis, Missouri, or a Kansas City that has a new airport under construction, I'm pretty concerned about whether American or United or the other airlines are going to continue to fly the same route structure and frequency to those markets, which could have a much more pronounced economic impact to those communities than, say, Orlando or Charlotte or Atlanta, which are going to be major airline hubs. It's just, we don't know how it's going to come back. So number one is earnings, support your market adjustments. Number three, believe it or not, they're transactions. Terry shared with me, not all things are locked up. He's even familiar with a land transaction that was done in the last 30 days. REITs are transacting. Institutional investors are transacting. There's a fair amount. It's not all going to be in CoStar, but it's going to be in REIT type databases. It's going to be go to Teachers Insurance or Pare, private equity, real estate. They're doing articles and stories about these all the time. Your local business journals. At the the end of March, there was a major hotel that was acquired in Atlanta in the Buckhead market at a record $500,000 a room, where they said, yeah, we know the COVID's going on, but we're still making a gamble. Was it a dumb gamble? Was it a right gamble? It is a market indication of activity. So you're gonna spend more time finding these things, analyzing, understanding the motivations behind the transaction. But CRE transactions have not come to a halt. And there are other indicators like I've shared with you. You can look at the TSA passenger count, you can look at rail time, you can look at NFIB data. There's a lot of these other sources that can help you with your market conditions adjustment. The jobs numbers that we get here this week, we get the ADP tomorrow on the private, and we'll get the government BLS on Friday. They will also be refreshing the state level and the MSA level numbers, even though they predate COVID. There'll be some proxy of what you can be beginning to look for going forward. But I would say to the appraisers, you can't give up. If you want to give up and take a shortcut, that's your litigation in a year from now. And your fees and your budgeting for time need to be greater, because it's going to involve more primary research that you're not going to find in, say, a CoStar, that you're going to have to find in other resources that involve more primary research. But bottom line, if you make a market conditions adjustment and you say the cap rate has changed or the NOI has changed, you better be able to support it. I'll give you one last one to help you. And that last one is, I think we're going to go through a major repricing of real estate rather than massive workouts and foreclosures. I'll give you an example. That restaurant owner that says now, a year from now, I don't just have a fire marshal that tells me how many people can be in my store or my restaurant. I'm going to have a public health official that says, even though the fire marshal says you can have 120 people in your restaurant from a fire safety, the public health says, no, you can only have 75. So if I can only have 75, that's going to affect my gross revenue. I know what my occupancy costs are and what they can be as a percentage of gross revenues. And if that's somewhere between 10 and 15%, and that's been cut by a third, my rent has to adjust by a third. And if I adjust my rent by a third and say I don't have any evidence of the cap rate changed, the value is changed. We're going to see it in office as we reverse the density ratios that we've seen from down to one employee per 150 square feet, maybe something back to 1 per 200. We're probably going to see demand shift back from urban to suburban. And we're already hearing and seeing that in public earnings releases by like D.R. Horton. It says their number one traffic profile is millennials in apartments in the urban areas that are coming out where rates are low, they still have a credit score, and they have some cash to buy a house in the suburbs. They don't want the density model. So there's lots of nuggets, and I would encourage you to look at those. If I can help in any way, I share them with the Appraisal Institute. I'm a scarred third generation MAI. I think the Appraisal Institute's doing a lot right now. If you haven't checked out what they're doing, it's almost like the CCIM Institute. They've got a COVID coverage. They've got lots of little tips and these type Q&As answered. So don't give up hope. And if you're in a tough one, either decide if it's too tough and you can't come up with an answer, I would turn down the assignment and offer maybe a consulting assignment rather than a valuation assignment, or budget more time and money. It's going to take more digging. I hope that helps, Terry.
Yeah, what a great answer, and really appreciate that. Lou Nemcoff and others were asking about these slides and the videos for the presentation. They will be available on the FLCCIM website. So tune into that, and you could get a slide packet or the entire video of the presentation. I know that it's always a great presentation. You know, Casey to me is really a voice of reason. And he mentions testing is one of the main methods of maybe more safely monitoring the opening of the economy. And I could not disagree with that. I agree wholeheartedly with that the amount of testing needs to increase. It's a necessary part of reopening the economy, and we need to do that eventually. I'll be honest with you, I don't believe the China figures either. I can't wait to sell you some Nevada oceanfront, but I did have this dream I shared with KC, this nightmare that I haven't been to my barber or stylist in a few months now, and I had a dream that I woke up with a man bun, but now I'm happy to report I could go to the tattoo parlor and get a tattoo to go along with it. So not all is bad, but I would say that if most of us had been infected with this virus, we would take the more conservative view. But we've got some great questions here, Casey, and one is a question that repeatedly comes up, and it's about the sectors of real estate. And which one do you think is going to come back the strongest? Multifamily, land, office, retail? Which one will take the biggest hit? Where are the best opportunities for commercial real estate brokers? And
Yeah,
so
that's what we all want to figure out. So we all want to figure out what our clients want us to tell them. So I would start first, differentiate for all property types, suburban versus urban. I think coming out of this thing, this is going to be like the night after World War II in the late 40s and the 1950s, where people were scarred after World War II. They were afraid of the coast. They were scarred after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, and they moved inland. And they wanted the GIs returning. They had limited budgets and incomes, and they wanted a picket fence and some spreaded area to start a family and be out of sight, out of mind from anything that that they saw in World War II. And a lot of it was the bombing of urban areas and cities. So they went to the suburbs, and we built the malls, and we built a whole nother world out there. I'm not saying we're going to see the demise of the urban areas, but I think that there is going to be a resurgence in demand in the suburbs for at least a couple or three property types. So let's look at multifamily. I think the multifamily, both from a balance sheet standpoint, we already knew that we were pushing the envelope on rent per square foot. You were seeing it, $3, $4+ a square foot was unsustainable to the workforce and the millennials and the entering the workforce as professionals with skill sets. And so their balance sheets have been hurt. My daughter's balance sheets have been hurt. So they're going to make an economic adjustment. And if that means they go to the suburbs versus the city, the first question they ask is, yeah, but I really don't want to commute. We're not going to be commuting like we did before. That I think the workforce is convinced and shown to our businesses that we can function, we can work remote. We don't need to be in the office every day. We don't need to commute into offices. So I think they're going to push that maybe I need an office 2 or 3 days a week or for meetings, but I want that in the suburbs. I don't want to be in high density areas. I don't want to be engaging with public transportation that could have all kinds of diseases, and I'm scarred about that. And I've also enjoyed the benefit of being closer to home and family. And I don't want to have a long commute again that takes me away from that. If I need to run home for an event or connect with my wife or family or my kids, I can do that. So I think in particular office, we are going to see a surge in suburban office demand. And I would be spending some time looking around who's got vacancy, who has floor plates, who's professionally managed, who owns it, is there sophisticated institutional ownership. I would have all those ducks in a row because I think as employees come back, they're communicating already. I'm on calls with companies and major financial institutions and employers, and they're already saying, we may be stuck with a lease on an urban building, but to get our workforce functioning, we're going to have something in the suburbs. And so they may not lease as much square footage, but they're going to have kind of what they call redundancy costs now. We're going to find companies have a redundancy cost for office work. So suburbs on office, on multifamily, that same workforce is going to follow where it wants with the work. And it doesn't want urban, it doesn't want high dense, and it needs a cost break. It already was coming. So they're finding that value add or Class B plus properties that have been renovated that are $1 a square foot less than the cities are going to be in high demand. And they don't want the high density. They want to walk up. They want a 2 or 3 story. They don't want to be in a high dense mixed use development, in a 10 or 20 story tower that's connected with a hotel that is going to have all these travelers coming from all over that they have no idea who they are, touching everything and whatnot. So I think multifamily is going to survive. I've distinguished in a previous one the difference between workforce multifamily and student housing. The workforce multifamily, 93% of that debt is held by Freddie, Fannie, and the GSEs, and they've said, we're not going to let it go into default. We're giving the borrowers of the owners of those properties forbearance as long as they give forbearance on the rent side. So we're not going to let the multifamily workforce product go in the toilet. The student housing is another story. We've accelerated, just like an online grocery, we've accelerated online learning. Most universities were experimenting with it. I know the University of Alabama, we initiated a distance learning program at the beginning of this school year, and it was surpassing our expectations. As parents and families deal with their own balance sheet from having job loss, revenue loss, you name it, this trickles down to their college-age kids. And they may say, you know what, we can't afford, we'll keep you at University XYZ, but you're going to have to go through the distance online learning program. And what we found is in most of the private student housing in these college towns is that they have act of God or act of university clauses that have allowed the tenants, the students, to break their lease. So both my daughters had leases that ran through August of this year. They had to come back home, leave the campus, do online learning. They lost their jobs. They didn't know what to do. So I said, bring me home your leases. We found an act of university type clause within the act of God, and we were able to terminate their leases in March. And so we got off the hook 4 months of rent that some property owner is going to pay the price for. So I think there's going to be a lot more carnage in the student housing space versus the workforce. In retail, I think whether it's urban or suburban, we're going to reprice it. It's not going to have the same density. 1 in 4, whether they're experiential or restaurant businesses, they're gone. So we're going to have to figure out how to repurpose, adaptively reuse retail space. Who are those new tenants that come into retail? My theory is that they're going to be more consumer staples oriented than experiential. And I think telemedicine is going to be a big opportunity. We can reuse branch banks for testing centers or telemedicine activities. You may find an end cap in your retail center is perfect for telemedicine, or an out parcel or a junior big box may all be, these junior big boxes are very desirable to telemedicine because they don't have a lot of windows. They're secure, they have privacy, and the entry and exit can be very well controlled, very well secured. So telemedicine has already identified windowless big box for the most part as an ideal form of telemedicine in the suburbs. I don't have any answers on hotel. It's going to be the big carnage area. The TREP folks, I will tell you, they just put stuff out and the numbers are just unbelievable. It's the worst ever. It's the worst of any model that they ever had that showed a worst case outcome. We're going to have mass carnage in the hotel industry, and it's going to be worse in those cities that have route structure consolidation. So if you're in a city, like say a Kansas City, brand new airport, but not a big purpose to go there, there's no Disney World, it's doesn't have a beach, it doesn't have a ski resort mountain, it probably takes a big hit. Those hotels take a big hit. Their convention center and those bonds take a big hit. And I think your adaptive reuse skills are going to become MVP tools to you really in the hospitality, entertainment space. And don't just think hotels. Think about venues. Think about convention centers. Think about big meeting space areas. All of these have different debt structures or bonds on them, public-private structures. They're not going to have the revenues that come back, not this year, maybe not even next year. They probably go through a complete workout or a repurposing. So I like suburban for most property types. I love it particularly for suburban on the office, suburban on the multifamily. Retail gets beaten up everybody, but I think it's adaptive reuse. I think adaptive reuse of retail in the suburbs is more viable because it's less dense and it's more appropriate for telemedicine type uses. And I can just say on hotel, we just pray. It's really going to be tough for that segment of our industry.
Thank you, Casey. Another just excellent answer. I was on a call yesterday that was put together by one of our chapter presidents from the Mid-Atlantic area. And a couple of the participants that were from the West Coast, Casey, had shared a situation that began, I think, in the Seattle area, where one of the citizens there, who's an avowed member of the American Communist Party, is advising tenants and even homeowners in these marginal communities to not pay their rents and to not pay the mortgages. This trend spread out to the Bay Area, and so we had the president of the California chapter on board, and this same thing spread out to the Bay Area. And again, they were appeared actually at a city council meeting, and this individual was advising tenants and advising homeowners of starter type housing, don't pay your rents, don't pay your mortgages. I think in one of those areas, I can't remember if it was Seattle or the Bay Area, the court intervened and said that it was unconstitutional for the council to rule on that type of request without actually hearing from the landlords. And so I think the matter, it hasn't died. There is a very strong movement from some people and a little more on the radical side to not pay rents, but they're not considering the landlord side. And a lot of landlords work very hard to acquire their properties, continue to work hard to maintain their properties. They have mortgages to pay, they have liabilities. So we hear what you're saying, and that's a concern going forward, certainly. And again, I want to repeat the slides in the video will be available. Eddie Blanton wanted to say, and he knew we were going to be on this meeting today, that the big announcement he wants to make, and he wants to put it in this context, is that we are open for business. That's CCIM, that's commercial real estate, that there is no normal. And he doesn't even like the reference of the new normal. He'd rather just say, we're open for business and leave it at that and just drive forward in the best manner that we can and adjust to what we have and play the cards that we've been dealt. But we have some other questions, and I think we have time for one more, Casey.
Now let me piggyback on Eddie's comment. That is so spot on. when you look at what, Greg Fine in their leadership, the board and the board of governance and, Eddie and Greg and you name it. If you've ever doubted the value of your dues, as a member and you went, well, what do I get out of this thing? This year you've earned it because these folks have been engaged on every single major issue, whether it was making sure that we were included as an essential service to go out and work when these orders were in place, whether it was being on top of 1031 exchanges and that they're not being extended and the importance of that, and that 1/3 of all of our real estate transactions in this country involve a 1031 exchange, and that CCIMs help facilitate a lot of that. So they've been all over making sure that you can work, that the issues that are relevant to your business and your clients are front and center before governors and Congress and got addressed and tackled. And I think Eddie's exactly right. So they've done all this blocking and tackling, and it's time to keep moving the ball forward. We do have the offense on the field. We do have leadership playing defensive tackle for us on issues that are causing impediments and frustration. But there is an offensive side to this, and CCIMs have the skill set, whether it's to help a client or a customer or an industry. What do I do? What do I do with my hotel portfolio? How do you convert one of these to affordable housing? What do I do with with airport stuff around the airport properties? I didn't know about airlines and looking at route restructuring, and am I in a good city or a bad city for that? What are the dimensions? The CCIMs have the marketing skills, the finance skills, the DCF skills to really do all of that. And we can't shutter back. And we do have to figure out how to maybe reprice our skill set. So just like I talked about adaptive reuse, just because a big box goes empty and it's not a Best Buy anymore doesn't mean it's useless real estate. It has another life and a purpose. And so just like us, where maybe we were doing transactions, we were doing more leasing transactions or physical conveyance transactions. Now we may be doing more consulting, more advisory. Stay in touch with those clients. Let them know you exist. Remind them about your skill set. Share information if there's a nugget here or a resource I've shared. Do that. I've done in doing these webinars. I've had as a result several CCIMs that have asked, could I do a short 20-minute or 30-minute follow-up call with one of their key clients that's on the fence, whether to close on a portfolio of office buildings right now or to walk from a deal, and help them walk through those issues with them. That's value that you bring to the table. So Eddie is exactly right. We're open for business. Remind them that CCIMs also know how to play offense in a tough time, and that we have the skill set to adaptively reuse ourselves. Instead of transactions, maybe it's consulting, advisory, or other type skills. So I really think that's a great message from Eddie and for all CCIMs to take to the bank.
Yes, and so we are the trusted experts that your clients should rely upon. But I have one final question for you, Casey, and it's a really great question, and we'll end the session. You clearly highlighted that the pot of money for unemployment will not last forever. And if we don't get back to business, how will this be funded? More federal funding? How long will this pandemic set us back in the economy? That's a great question, a complicated question.
Well, it is, and the answer comes over the next 2 to 4 weeks, because all but 5 states will be out of unemployment insurance funds if they really process. If Florida gets its IT system working and actually processes everybody, even Florida is out over the next 30 days. So if we don't have some success and we don't get this going by June, all but maybe 5 states will be having to borrow from the federal government. We have precedent for this. We did it in 2009 and 10. The Federal Reserve helped facilitate the facilities, and Congress passed legislation to also help fund it, but it was a loan. And I don't think the government's just going to give this away. So it means your states become more in debt. And what I would encourage everybody to look at, if you really don't want to sleep tonight, go look at the U.S. debt clock and look at how fast it's run and moved forward in the last 30 to 60 days. And it's not just our federal fundings, it's at the state level, it's at the local government level. And many people will be shocked that the total indebtedness by local governments exceeds that of states. At states, it's around $1.2, $1.3 trillion. And at the local government level, it's at double that. And so when you start adding these up and look at the liability that we have as citizens for our local tab, our state tab, and the federal tab, and then everything else, our personal indebtedness, we already owe as citizens. The average taxpayer right now already owes its share of all the debt that we've got is over $250,000. That's more than the median price of a home in this country. So we've gone in a relatively short period, decade, 15 years, from really being fiscally balanced and settled to basically each of us as a taxpayer owe the equivalent of a median price home in this country. So it is a very serious issue. I don't raise it for people to get scared and not sleep at night and do more drinking. I raise it because only if we have awareness can we then begin to tackle problems. And the problem we face right now is as Congress re-engages and comes back from their Easter and spring recess, is they want to spend trillions and trillions more. And the Federal Reserve has already said, I can't worry about inflation and our currency being worthless today. I have to worry about uncontrolled chaos from unemployment that goes from 30 million to 50, 60, or 70 million. Numbers like we couldn't even imagine during the Great Depression. And so he said, I'm throwing everything I can. I'm printing all the money I can. I'm going to do everything I can. There's a day of reckoning. And so we need to understand that. We need to make sure that our elected leaders at local, state, and federal levels are funding and going into debt for our needs, not our wants. We need to do less Kennedy Center renovations in DC and more funding and stuff at the unemployment level. When I look at the priorities, ask your politicians, as us as an industry, what are our top 3 funding priorities at the state and federal level that impact our business? And I would argue unemployment insurance is probably number 1. And we'll worry about property taxes and all these other issues later. But if we don't get our workforce back to work, if they don't have a paycheck, the next issues that we begin to deal with are rising crime rates, civil unrest. Those are things we don't want to go down the path for. So as an industry, we ought to know what our top 2 or 3 priorities are that we support and that we and that we're not part of every other industry saying, well, we'd also like this and that and whatever. So it's a very serious problem. It comes home to roost in the next 30 days, and we'll have to see what the Fed and the Congress will do. I will tell you, the June Fed meeting is one I would schedule time to watch and listen to briefing, because we're going to hear from the Fed on how effective all these intervention facilities have been, where they see we're going, whether they're seeing we're making a dent, whether critical metrics like unemployment, or whether they're bending the curve like the number of cases. And if not, that's really going to be a fairly scary day of reckoning from the Fed. So I would encourage y'all to dial in and watch the FOMC press conference and briefing for the June. It's really going to tell us a lot as to where we're headed. But it's coming at us. This isn't months and a year or 2 years away. We're going to know really quickly here how bad this is going to get.
Thank you, Casey, again for a great presentation. I want to thank our 100 participants, or over 100 participants. I want to thank the Puerto Rico chapter for joining us today. I want to thank our sponsors, RealNext and American Home Title of Tampa Bay. Among our many sponsors at the chapter level, I was hoping you'd be able to speak today. We'll make sure that we get you a voice at our next meeting. Casey, we'll see you in 2 weeks, and we look forward to it. And next week, join at the same time at 12 noon, and the Florida chapter will bring Todd Kuhlman, one of our excellent instructors, to do a presentation on Business Analyst Pro, and he's really just a great instructor, a great speaker, and it's a great presentation that I've already seen and shared with him. So thank you so much, everybody, and we look forward to seeing you in 2 weeks, Casey. Be well.
Thanks, Terry. Thank you.
Be well, everybody.